Conversations on race and policing began in response to the police killing of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. In this partnership between CSU San Bernardino and the Brennan Center for Justice, we hope to engage in ongoing discussions related to the history and current context of race, policing, and criminal justice with guests from diverse academic fields and backgrounds.
Welcome again to another conversation on race and policing. My name is Stan Futch, and I would like to pass it on to Jeremy Murray for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Stan. California State University, San Bernardino acknowledges that the land on which our San Bernardino facility is sited is the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mariam, commonly referred to as the Serrano people, which in the contemporary era are represented by two federally recognized Indian tribes, the Yuhaviatam of San Manuel Nation and the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Our histories and stories are intertwined in this space, and by sharing them in culturally appropriate ways, we honor and celebrate our Indigenous neighbors and partners. And since 1965, CSUSB's development has benefited and will continue to benefit from this land's location and resources, and we recognize this. Along with this land acknowledgement, this university affirms its tribal sovereignty and our responsibility to work with these tribes to further mutual respect and gratitude for all those involved. And I'll toss it to my colleague, Matt Patino, to introduce Dr. Yelana Sims.
Thank you. Dr. Yelana Sims is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina, which brings her home, being a native of Spartanburg, South Carolina. She received her undergraduate degree in African American and Diaspora Studies at Vanderbilt University, and both her Ph.D. in African American Studies and a graduate certificate in Public History from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Her research interests include the histories of race, technology, and gender and sexuality in the U.S. She is currently working on her first book, tentatively titled When the Flesh Knows Its Flesh: Black Women, Sex Work, and Technology, 1880 to 2000, which will examine African American sex workers in the 19th and 20th centuries and their interactions with technology, focusing on how technological advancements were used to surveil and convict, as well as advertise and enrich sex workers of this period. Dr. Sims argues that Black women have been historically utilized as machines of reproduction, physical labor, and meaning-making, which has complicated their interactions with technological innovations. She enjoys teaching courses on women's history, African American history and culture, technology histories, and the links between all three. Her research has been supported by the University of Massachusetts Amherst Public History Program, the Harvard University Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America, and others. We are very happy to welcome Dr. Yelana Sims.
Thank you all so much, and thank you for having me. I know I'm not going to take up even half of the 50 minutes that we were given. I'm going to keep myself to a tight, I'm hoping 22 at the absolute most, okay? So I just wanted to give a bit of the lay of the land. I will be going in discussing my entire book project and then tying it into the particular topics that this forum discusses with a couple of examples from Chicago and from San Francisco. So as Matt mentioned, my first monograph is tentatively titled When the Flesh Knows It Is Flesh: Black Women, Sex Work, and Technology in the 20th Century, although I do go a little earlier as well. When the Flesh Knows It Is Flesh is a study of Black sex workers' engagement with technological shifts of the 20th century. However, I am both expanding and contracting the definition of sex workers and the definition of technology and technological shifts. I include scientific and medical innovations. I include innovations on particular technologies. For instance, how do we get from a police call box all the way to CCTV and cell phones with tracking chips and GPS locations and things of the sort. But inherently, when you are studying a population such as sex workers, you end up also analyzing how technological advancement has been used for surveillance and criminalization. And so, alongside this focus on physical technologies that one can touch and one can engage with, and the products of those technologies, say pornography or things of the sort, I'm also engaging with an idea of what does it mean for sex work to be a crime and what does it mean to surveil sex work. And as Matt also mentioned, my work lies primarily at this nexus of history of technology, African American studies, and gender and sexuality studies. The major arguments that I make in When the Flesh Knows It Is Flesh is that Black women were treated as machines of reproduction, agricultural labor, and meaning making during enslavement. And that last one, machines of meaning making, has extended beyond enslavement. Technologies and scientific or medical innovations have depended upon societal beliefs and opinions of women and their bodies to make claims to legitimacy and dependability. There's a great book by Alice Maurice, The Cinema and Its Shadow, which talks about the representation of race and the difference in skin tone, literally light versus dark, as one of the primary methods that the film camera proved its usefulness and faithfulness to an American audience. I take this a step further and go, it is not just the difference in light or dark shades, but it is also a testament to proving representations of truth. What are the already widely held beliefs of society, and how have things like the camera or audio recording technologies contributed to reinforcing those societal beliefs we already have? I One of the also main arguments that I think it seems to kind of go without saying, but is actually a very large part of my project, is that the lived experiences of Black sex workers provide a valuable lens to examine technology. And this is not just limited to the 20th century, but unfortunately, because of the massive amounts of technological shifts that occur in the 20th century, it is easiest to identify Black sex workers and their work with technology during this period. And I'll show you what I mean when I'm going through my example from Chicago in just a little bit. Um, the main theoretical contribution of my work is the idea of fleshy knowledge, which is an embodied knowledge that theorizes how the Black female body has been used to create meaning and profit, oftentimes creating meaning for those other than the woman herself, but sometimes creating profit for her herself. And that is why Black sex workers are a focus of this project. Um, so let's get into what you all care about the most that I'm going to be touching upon today. I want to talk about immigration and policing from a historic point of view. I'm going to be showing you a couple of maps from 1890 Chicago that were crafted by a third party, not the government, not from the census, to show the ethnic layout of different neighborhoods in Chicago. And I'm going to discuss some of the questions that these maps helped answer for me, but also the questions that these maps created. Um, and inherently, this is tied to histories of race and neighborhood segregations, both determined by local governments, but also the legacies of that, and where there are still many, many pockets of neighborhoods across the country, not just in the North, Northeast, Midwest, or West, that are delineated or separated by, along racial lines. Of course, governmental surveillance, but also questions of assimilation. And that is assimilation in terms of race and ethnicity, but also in terms of criminalization and who we as a society have defined as a criminal. So, the first example I really want to talk about and dig into is Chicago. And this is from a chapter that I call Make Space for Respectability, Vice District Borders, Immigration, and Governmental Surveillance. What I'm showing you here is a map of the three major red light districts of Chicago. You can see they are dated in that key. The main one that we will be talking about is number one, the Levee District, which existed from the 1870s to about 1905. The 22nd Street levee, the one that's furthest south on this map, exists until about 1912, and the West Side District is the early 1900s, not a cemented date. But what's really interesting about all of these is that Chicago, excuse me, as one of the oldest cities within the nation, follows a pattern that most major cities followed, and even still do today, which is that the red light districts, the vice districts, are almost always located very close to the central business district. In most northern or western cities, they are also more than likely bordered by what would eventually become Chinatown, Koreatown, depending on where we're discussing. This is something that stays the same almost no matter what city you're talking about. And this is kind of a known fact when you're talking about sex work history, gambling, and number running history, all of these things. But what isn't discussed as much are the actual racial delineations within these vice districts, and also how was police surveillance and policing handled when a non-residential district borders a very residential district like this. So I've taken the West Side District and the Levee, and what you can see here are actually a lot of different things. I kind of went a little crazy with the colors. My apologies. So let's start with the what was inherent to the map before I got my hands on it. What you see, the numbered sections of these vice districts are the portions of the vice district that are overwhelmingly Black. And what you may notice is that the majority of these areas exist on the borders of the vice district. Okay. So in the levee, we have number one, which is Coons Hollow, three, six, and four, Little Cheyenne, the Badlands, and Dead Man's Alley. These are all predominantly Black. These are predominantly Black brothels, bars, and gambling dens. What I have, and also I want to be very clear, this map in its original format without, as you can see, all the colors and other things that I've added is from Cynthia Blair's I've Got to Make My Living, which focuses on Black sex workers solely in Chicago in the 19th through the early 20th century. What I have added to this map, the red dots, are the locations of police call boxes. These call boxes are installed starting in 1881. Approximately a decade after the levee, at least, is first initially founded. So the levee has a very interesting history. It's technically called the Customs House District, Custom House Levee. There's a host of different names for it, but most people knew it as the levee. In the Great Fire of 1871, most of Chicago burned to the ground, especially things south of the Central Business District. The levee is literally rebuilt after that Great Fire. So that shows that there is some intention on the part of aid societies and local government to have a red light district in this area. And that is fundamentally true. What you will notice is there are no, in the levee, there aren't any call boxes inside the red light district. What this means is that those who were living and working on the borders of these red light districts were overwhelmingly coming into more contact with police, with neighbors who were given the keys to these call boxes, and with just the beginnings of a 20th century governmental surveillance project. The blue dots show actual police precincts. Okay. One thing to be noted about these police call boxes, these are a very, very new thing at this point. In the early 1880s, excuse me, most municipal areas are only using them for fire brigades, not for policing purposes. Chicago has one of the earliest adoptions of this system purely for policing purposes. The keys to these police call boxes are given to respectable citizens that live and work around the locations of the call boxes. We can assume a couple of things here. First and foremost, inhabitants of the red light district are not on that list of reputable and respectable citizens. And because of that, that means that everyone who lives distinctly in the exact borders of the red light district is coming into consistent and constant contact with neighbors who have the power to put them in jail on their own at all times. The fact that the overwhelming amount of Black areas exist on these borders is also not a coincidence, or at least that's what I argue. So once the police call boxes are installed and these keys are given to reputable citizens, we have a different navigation of governmental surveillance than what many of us may be very used to when we think of governmental surveillance, which is it is the government that is doing the most of the surveillance. In Chicago and other major cities, it was actually the neighbors of these vice districts. And then we come to what is known as the whole house maps. These are maps. I'm going to zoom in so you can see better. But as you can see, there's a myriad of colors here. These colors represent different ethnicities and literally where they live, the actual physical address that they live at. What's most interesting about this is that we have one of those subsections of hold on. So you can see this is Taylor Street going east to west. At the top of the page is Polk Street going east to west. Bottom of the page, West 12th Street, east to west. Okay. North to south, you have railroads over here. That's why a lot of this has no color whatsoever. These are businesses rather than residences. But north to south, hold on. I'm gonna move your faces. I'm so sorry. We have Plymouth, Custom House, and Clark. So if I take you back here, Clark Street, running north to south, cuts through at between Polk, Taylor, and 12th. We are looking dead at the Badlands, an overwhelmingly Black portion of this red light district. But what's close to them? You can kind of see the keys that are on the left and the right sides of this map. And what I found the most interesting is that there is a Roman Catholic church up there on Polk and Clark, northernmost corner. There are oh goodness, now it's small for me. Hold on. There are a large amount of Italian, English speaking, but possibly not American, um, German, Polish, and other. Yes. And if I'm not mistaken, there's also a good amount of Russian families in this area as well. And so, if you remember at the beginning, I mentioned that finding these maps solved some questions for me. It gave me actual addresses to attempt to track down and find who might have lived there. Did they have the keys to these call boxes? What might this have looked like? But it also raised a lot of other questions because now I'm wondering, how do these immigrant groups, excuse me, how do they affect the policing or participate in the policing that goes on in this area? Not even just that, but during this time period, what does ethnicity and race, what does the everyday Chicagoan understand to be the ethnicity and race of an Italian person or a Russian person? And this is the late 1800s. So to suffice it to say, the answer is it's complicated and a case by case basis. But when looking at arrest records, which are skewed, of course, we know that because of who gets arrested the most. But when you're analyzing surveillance, who gets arrested the most is actually a pretty good uh, data point, let's say. I know from arrest records concerning prostitution in Chicago that the majority of arrests and raids that occur in this area that are not due to scheduled raids or raids for protection money or whatever it may be are because of calls made to these call boxes. And so I am now in a position where I can ask questions and art and make arguments about how non-Black and non-American people understood criminality and their relationship spatially to it in ways that may have made their lives easier, better. What does it mean to be given keys and told you're more respectable than the people across the street when possibly the everyday Chicagoan might not think you are? What does it mean to be given such a large plot of land? I don't know if you all have ever been to that church. That church is not small. That church is not small. Um, and what does it mean for a Catholic church to have this kind of land in a city like Chicago, post fire, post rebuilding? And so I argue that non at the time they're labeled as non-native born or foreign born. Um, Foreign-born nationals in Chicago at this moment who are living on the outskirts or completely separate from these red light districts. I argue that part of the reason they are participating in making these calls on these call boxes, in policing their neighbors, is in a bid to distance themselves from the idea of criminality that exists right across the street, and also to help define themselves as contributing citizens of a decidedly American city. That in this way, they are able to make a claim to Americanness and, in some cases, whiteness by participating in the surveillance of Black bodies, specifically in this case, Black female bodies engaging in sex work. Um, See, I knew. I was like, 22 is going to be what gets me. All right. This is the only slide I'm going to give you on San Francisco, but we're jumping ahead 100 years, and I want to show how similar this is. These are two heat maps that are showing you the change in number of HIV/AIDS cases in San Francisco. Okay. On the right, we have 1996. On the left, we have 1984. San Francisco is known for its handling of HIV/AIDS in the early 80s, overwhelmingly positively, right? But it's also known for its focus on specifically the white gay male population of San Francisco, who are centered around this neighborhood called Castro that you can see most easily on the left, on the right. The Tenderloin, which you can see is also one of the hot points in the city of HIV/AIDS, was technically kind of still is the red light district of San Francisco during this period, where the overwhelming amount of its sex workers were not white, and many, many of them were addicted to drugs. Now, what ends up happening is that, as we can see, they have high numbers of the virus by 1996. That is due to the sharing of needles, not the spread of the virus through sexual contact. Even still, policing of sex workers gets pushed so hard during this period over fears that they will be the vehicle that spreads HIV/AIDS to heterosexual households. That when the story gets retold decades and decades down the line, the Tenderloin is not a part of the discussion. Instead, the Tenderloin gets discussed as where San Francisco police or uh, mutual aid groups did the majority of their work along economic lines, meaning because people were not as rich as those in Castro, that is why the majority of mutual aid societies were over there, not because it was the long-standing red light district. And so I want to show, and we know San Francisco is an extremely diverse city, right? And if anyone in here is from the Bay Area, you probably know exactly how the racial or ethnic breakdown looks nowadays. Slightly different back then, but not by much. And so it's also very interesting to see kind of not so much the flip. There is still more governmental surveillance within these black heavy neighborhoods, but also that the story that's being told about governmental surveillance is one that's being told about a particular population without race coming into it, and instead with ideas of risk and contamination. And that is where my questions about governmental surveillance and my emphasis on medical innovation come to hand in hand in a separate chapter. So I wanted to kind of show this to show the myriad of ways that you us when you're studying sex workers or any other population that has been considered inherently criminalized, they are participating in something understood to be a crime. You become inventive with the ways that you use these criminalization statistics and data and arrest records and things like that. And you start asking questions about the whys and the hows of governmental surveillance and capture, and race and gender and sexuality, rather than taking the numbers at face value. Uh, Haha, 24 minutes, but I will give myself an extra two. I'm okay with that. Um, I will, I will, I th- should I stop sharing? I'd like to see people again. Yeah, I can stop sharing. And I'd love to hear any and all questions. Um, there's nothing better you can do than ask an academic about what they do. So make my Wednesday, please. And thank you again so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Sims. My question is Chicago. It's interesting to see the diversity around Chicago because I've been to Chicago and I've I thought it was very separated.
Mhm.
But the map shows it's kind of integrated a little bit.
It really is. And I think that at that moment in the 1890s, it's integrated by our standards because what we now understand as the South Side of Chicago, that's where the majority of the Black population is just starting to come into existence and experience that shift of the Black population down there. So instead, you have for a while a very similar kind of situation to New York and San Francisco, where all immigrants, foreign born, like immigrants, not migrants from any other portion of the United States, but immigrants, are focused in certain areas of the city. And had the fires, because Chicago has a horrible history of fires, had the fires with an S not occurred, then maybe the race and ethnic layout would look a little different. And it may look a little more similar to New York City. At one point, Chicago is only second to New York City in how many foreign-born nationals are living within city limits. And so for a while there, basically the only Black people that you see living in those sections of the map that I showed you are those that are participating in underground economies. Then there's a shift to non-underground economies, like the everyday Black Chicagoan ends up living on the south side of Chicago, specifically south of, excuse me, what is it? The south of there's a particular number that during the 1893 World's Fair they start saying push them beyond this boundary. And then once we hit the Great Migration, more people basically come in and fill in that space. But if you go to that portion of Chicago today, it is all business. There is very little residential neighborhood feeling there at all.
And it didn't turn to white flight back in those days.
Uh, I don't know if we would characterize it as white flight because I don't know that we can say for sure that those who were doing the flight were considered white.
Uh,
And I actually didn't mean to rhyme that, I really promise. Uh, there is a lot of movement of the different immigrant groups within Chicago. But once you have like there's a Russian Orthodox church in Chicago. Once you have something like a religious institution in one of those areas, there's much less flight that occurs. Normally, there's a little bit more staying power. When the levees or the red light districts are closed, there is not that kind of institution to hold the Black population to those areas in the same way.
Matt,
I have been saving this questions since Chicago when I saw your presentation. What jumped out to me on one of the maps you showed where these call boxes are located, and
Mhm.
especially just on the outskirts, but also where the precincts are located. And one of them is sitting right in the middle of one of these red light districts. And so, and I thought of this the other night because John Oliver had a whole thing on police stings. How much were police just kind of turning a blind eye until it became, quote, necessary to take some action
All the time.
all the time?
All the time, every day, all the time.
Okay.
Um, so vice districts bring money to a city.
Hmm.
That's why most of these major cities had one from the mid to late 1800s all the way up until about World War One. By the time we enter World War One, we're now like, no, the morality, and we close most of them across the country. Um, However, up until then, the police would do regular raids, but more often than not, those raids are because a, a gambling den or a brothel is getting a little too, they're making too much money,
Mm,
or there was some sort of fight that occurred between patrons or clients or something like that. But
mhm.
oftentimes the police were like, we already know who the frequent flyers are. We're not really that worried about it unless it starts causing issues. And what we see in like local newspapers, not just in Chicago, but even in Philadelphia, which had a very tiny vice district in comparison, quite frankly, um, we see that in newspapers, once we start like we're in Reconstruction after the Civil War, this discussion about race and Black people, and we're ramping up to what will be the Great Migration. There starts to be a lot of discussion about, like, okay, but what about these Black people that you've been letting do all sorts of things
Right.
for who knows how long over here. And there are a lot of outside pressures on the police and municipal governments in order to, like local governments, to get them to close the districts, which they eventually do,
Mhm.
or at the very least raid them more often to keep them in line. Um, the one thing that I would like to know more about, but I just don't think the records exist, is I would love to know, like, were there certain call boxes that were always being used? Were there certain like
Yeah.
patrolmen who were like, every time, I patrol, someone calls me to the corner of Polk, and you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
were there people that were intentionally understanding the levy or these sex workers or anyone in the area as
Mhm.
nuisances and inviting governmental surveillance regularly leading up to the closure of the levy?
I also noticed from the map that there's a timeline for each of these districts, and these they seem to be migrating more westward away from the city center. I wonder if you were able to find some mechanism that Chicago PD had in place to follow. I would assume there are going to be some of the same players moving from location to location, but to kind of surveil and follow them into their new locations to identify them.
Interestingly enough, there isn't much like this. There are a couple of very well-known madams.
Hmm.
One thing I didn't really talk about, but that I do want to make mention of, we are at the point in sex work history where we are not talking about pimps, we are not
Hmm.
talking about traffickers or anything of the sort. We are talking about the majority of sex workers, even if they are streetwalkers, meaning they don't work exclusively out of a brothel, they are under the purview of a madam who owns a brothel or owns a space that rents out rooms by the hour or something of the sort.
Hmm.
And so there are a few notable madams in Chicago specifically. We we don't see them move around that much.
Hmm.
When one
Okay.
red light district closes, if they close, they tend to move cities entirely
Oh,
rather
okay.
than attempt to go up to, let's say, the West Side District or the
Hmm.
22nd Street. Um, and I think that's for a myriad of reasons. It's actually kind of the norm outside of the United States, but it's there doesn't seem to be much in the way of attempts to track individuals from one location to another.
And as we get to the period of the Great Migration at the end of World War One and into Prohibition, did you see these red light districts not be shut down, but just go underground?
I think invariably, more than likely, they did, or at the very least, individual actors did. Um, but And this progressive era period of like 1900 or 1895 till about 1920 um, is actually like boards of public health that do a
Mhm.
lot of work to contribute to closing down these red light districts. There's Board of Public Health that claim that they
Mhm.
are hotbeds of communicable diseases and venereal disease. And especially when we're about to enter into a war, you cannot
Yeah.
have spaces where venereal disease is running rampant because they believe that, the soldiers are just going to, of course, absolutely end up with something. Um, and so there's that, and there is also the 1910 Mann Act, which
Mhm.
does the majority of the work of making these vice districts, the everyday person understands them as sites of, what's the best way to say it? Corruption, like moral
Mhm.
corruption. The 1910 Mann Act, which is actually called the 1910 Act Against the Traffic of White Slaves,
Yeah.
or the White Slavery Traffic Act, or there's a
Mhm.
few different ways to
Yeah.
discuss it, um, bars the transportation across state lines of women, white women
Mhm.
specifically. Although we still use the Mann Act today, we've just updated it significantly in the past 115 years. But it bars the transportation of white women across state lines for any sort of sexual purpose, including consensual sex. And so, um, uh, but the white slave scare itself convinces millions of people that if there are white women specifically in these vice districts, they have been forced to be there. And therefore, these districts must be dismantled with prejudice. They must be dismantled, and those that are within them must be punished to the full extent of the law. And Black women are not immune from that. And so you do see uh, women who have been working as sex workers for a very, very long time. They have to go underground. They have to go
Mhm.
underground or hope that they can find a job in, the up and coming pornography industry because film
Right.
cameras are finally starting to
Yeah.
produce things regularly, but the majority of them don't. And so, yeah.
So,
So the time period, I'm sorry.
oh, go
Sorry,
ahead.
No,
sir.
you're fine.
No.
So the time period, yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little more towards the technology. I think we're the late 19th century is really when we're beginning to use mug shots. Fingerprinting is still far away, but what other kinds of technologies were being used to surveil and police?
So we do have actually, I was able to flip through a picture book of mugshots, specifically of sex workers in Chicago. They only have them from like 1 or 2 years because the others were damaged in a fire. Because again, um, I don't know. I really feel for Chicago most of the time. But they are using cameras for what we now would understand to be mugshots, but they're more so of a frequent flyer wall. These are the people that come through all the time. If you see this person, you go ahead and fill out this is what they did. Just go ahead and put prostitution down, man. Like, don't even worry about the rest of it. That's what it is. Um, it is the call boxes, which are telegraph lines. Um, think old school call. I had a picture up kind of in the slides, but I was about to say think of an old school call box, and if there is anyone here under the age of 30, you've probably never seen one. Um, but, uh, yeah, but even call boxes, telegraph lines, brand new technology that's really hasn't been used very much, and is not being used by most major cities. However, Chicago invests heavily in their call boxes because they don't have the money to hire more personnel. So they say we would rather invest in technology than attempt to hire a whole lot more policemen. And it's that tense, and that's why Chicago is a little different. New York City is like, no, 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 no. There's too much New York for us to cover this on foot. You know what I mean? And Chicago kind of feels that way, but they're like, those call boxes worked when we had that fire. What if we expanded a little bit? And you see them expanding the locations of those call boxes for 15 years straight. And eventually they're almost everywhere. I gave you a little sampling, but if you notice, they were on like almost every other corner. That extends throughout. If I were to map the whole city, basically the levee would be just this one little empty place, and everywhere else, there's like a call box everywhere. People don't live there, doesn't matter. Might need one. Just throw it anywhere. And so yeah, I would say the main technologies being used at the time are the camera and are those telegraph lines and call boxes. Eventually, they invest in some cars, um, but even then, they do some is this worth it math. And for Chicago, it takes a little bit before it's worth it for them.
So the call box was the first inventor of Karen.
I I can't say that, but I think you can.
I'm saying, go ahead, Jeremy.
I also, yeah, I mean, I think the sort of Karen effect definitely in play, but also the last thing you said, Elaine, about the preference to invest in technology, that also seems like it comes right from this moment and that sort of techno optimism. But I just wanted to say, as a historian, and I know Matt also, so we always love having historians on these sessions. We don't have as many as we want to. Of course, I joke with Mary Texera, a colleague who's a sociologist, and we sort of have an ongoing sort of count of how many of each of the different disciplines. But I just love this sort of masterclass of reading that historical primary source, and I think I hope our history students who join or who watch this later are taking notes in terms of a real critical engagement with this visual text, this visual source. Um, it was just really really cool to follow along with you reading this thing as a China historian. It's all very new to me. What wasn't new also was the surveillance, the sort of horizontal surveillance by your neighbors. That's something that
Mhm.
becomes very very big in China in the 1950s, where everyone is potentially an enforcer, everybody around
Mhm.
you, and so I think in the American context, that's sort of one direction, though. Also, in terms of it's not quite possible
Mhm.
in the same way for black neighbors to report white neighbors in the same and get the same probably
Yep.
energetic.
Outcomes. Yeah.
Um, but the big thing, sorry, and just really loved the talk and learned a lot, and I'm excited for the book, and I hope you'll come back as a cause for you to come back and join us when the book hits the shelves. The phrase that I wanted to ask you about came right in the very beginning of the talk, and that is meaning making. Um,
Mhm.
that I think is really exciting. You gestured to the things like the sort of morality of whether it was the earlier temperance kind of movement or um, how those sort of things happened. But it almost sounded like um, black sex workers are being used as a sort of inscription, as a mode of meaning making of the sort of big S self. Um,
Mhm.
I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that because it's so important to the central part of our series, which is priorities.
Yeah.
And when we say what matters and what implicitly or explicitly doesn't matter and how it matters. And that meaning making seems to again be a kind of um, something that we can unpick and really
Mhm.
get to the heart of. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that phrase as a historian in this specific context, or anything you'd like to carry on that.
Yes, thank you so much. That's actually one of the biggest and to me most fun aspects of my project, and I don't get to talk about it as much. Um, I tell my students all the time, especially when I'm teaching women's history or I'm teaching African American history, we are defined by what we are as much, if not a little less so, than how we are defined by what we are not. And I put it in the context of American history and saying, how do we as an American culture define blackness? And at various points in American history, it has been defined as not whiteness. Whatever whiteness is not, that is what blackness is. Whatever blackness is, whiteness cannot be. The same thing goes for most things that we've put as a culture on a binary: male, female, old, young, like all of these things that we assume are at two distinct ends of a spectrum. And so when I'm talking about meaning making, and a part of that theory of fleshing knowledge that I'm fleshing out and teasing out is the fact that Black women historically seem to have been very obviously knowledgeable about the ways that their bodies and the stereotypes surrounding what they do, what they don't do, what they think, what they don't think, are used to define others. That by framing Black women and Black sex workers in particular as inherently deviant. Well, of course, you know, the white slave trade must be forcing white women to participate in sex work because Black women are doing so willingly. And that can't be the same for both groups. That is a large said and unsaid aspect of that thought process and that point in history. And so when we're talking about meaning making, and specifically in this project, I also use kind of the phrase subversive meaning making. And it's why the project is titled When the Flesh Knows It Is Flesh. There's been a lot of theorizing of the Black body as doing all this work and creating meaning and being the foil or juxtaposition to a lot of things. But what does it mean to inhabit that body and to know that you are considered flesh, that you are considered the other that is necessary to define someone else's self? Um, and so I say that if we take that understanding that okay, yes, but Black people, and specifically in this case, Black women who engage in sex work, know that their images, when we're talking about pornography, that their base nature, that just who they are, has uses outside of the ones they've ascribed to themselves, then how do they subvert that? How do they make their own meanings? How do they engage with the camera when filming a 1930 something pornographic short that's known as Night Riders, but it's KKK Night Riders? You know what I mean? And it's an interracial pornographic film, but it doesn't seem to be fully, was definitely not supportive of interracial sex. And so, but there's a Black woman acting in it. It's not like she didn't know what she was acting in. And we can just say, yeah, they needed the money. They did what they had to do to, yeah, but you can also do that in different ways. There's a myriad of scholars, Jennifer Nash, Mireille Miller-Young, that talk about the different like facial acting and expressions and things that Black pornography stars do. And I make the case that yes, it's because they know whoever's watching it are making their own meaning and sharing it amongst the room that they are watching this pornographic film in. And they want to interrupt that moment for a quick second. They want to say, You think that by watching this pornographic film, you are taking advantage of me or you are using me for your use. Instead, I have used you for my use. I have taken what I know you think and I've made it make me profit. And that's kind of how I play with meaning making and subversive meaning making.
And in the early days, that was the only way black women could get into the pornography business was to be treated
Hmm.
poorly.
Yeah.
But my question is something completely different. So as the uh, prostitution, the red light district evolved, you said that it's pretty similar, the locations of the red light district in most cities, and you said a lot of them are near Chinatown and so
Hmm.
on. And as the black women or streetwalkers are in the madams' homes and such, Chinatown was doing massage parlors
Hmm.
that were given the same. Could you talk a little bit about that?
And so this is actually really interesting because I'm currently teaching a course on race, gender, and history of American medicine. And we have been talking about Mexican and Mexican American women and some of the experimentation projects that were going on in California that resulted in forced sterilization, but also the way that Chinese and Chinese American women in San Francisco and a couple other cities in California were they weren't assumed to be prostitutes, but they were almost assumed to be without an idea of sex in a very particular way, that allowed for an idea that they could be taken advantage of, but not that, not to the extreme of sex work, as it were. And the massage parlors, that comes a little later, but in my opinion, it is race, like as a construct, doing the same type of work that it's doing with black sex workers, just in a slightly different context and ending in a slightly different environment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
So I think this question from our Q&A entry from one of our participants, I think folds right into that last question. Do you think the connection created between sex work and transmission of disease
Mm.
contributed to how sex workers are treated within the criminal justice system? And this goes as far as testing, collecting DNA, charging with them with a more serious crime on the premise of being a threat to public health.
Absolutely. First and foremost, absolutely. I'm gonna put that question just there so I can read the words of it. But the answer is absolutely. In fact, a central aspect of my argument and a reading I actually assigned my class a few weeks back is Scott W. Stern's venereal doctrine, where he compares cases brought against local governments or the state, where men who were accused of sexual assault and women who were accused of prostitution um, said that the forced medical examinations that they had to undertake to detect venereal disease was against their right, went against their right against self-incrimination and to privacy. And Stern finds that two, almost a one, men who had been accused of sexual assault had their right to privacy and right against self-incrimination upheld, and those medical examinations would get thrown out. However, women that were accused of prostitution almost never had that right upheld for them, with the justification being that they are a threat to the general public through the possible spread of disease, wherein an individual who stands accused of sexual assault is a danger that has passed and to one individual, and that then makes the two cases fundamentally different. And you see public health departments use this rhetoric and this reasoning to force medical examination, STI and STD testing. At one point, many American cities had sex workers walking around with cards that said the last date that they were examined, and certified that they were disease-free. Um, and then you also see this relationship to disease taken for granted and assumed to be incorrect, like in the example of the HIV/AIDS epidemic that I mentioned before. Um, on one day, it seems like, sex workers are supposedly the main venue of spread, and then the next, it's okay, we're worried about this, but we're worried about these other people more. And so I do think that there is a proven merging of the idea of risk, and particularly risk of disease and spread with sex work and sex workers. And I think that that relationship is further fortified when the sex worker is a person of color. And so, yes, and yeah.
So, while the women are carrying cards about when the last were tested, the number one guy in the porn industry, John Holmes, was carrying AIDS through the rampant through the whole thing. So it's you're right. It's uh, in the third district. They had the police station dead center, like Matt mentioned, and I found that very interesting because in the red light district, it was on the outside, and
Mhm.
they didn't want to scare people away. I assume that was their reasoning behind it. But in the why, what was the third district? What was the makeup of the third district?
The makeup of the third district, less Black people. That precinct existed there because it is where a lot of the not town, city laborers lived. In fact, there is a labor riot that occurs smack dab in the middle of the West Side District. And so I think that was me. I apologize. And so the West Side District is different. She's on her own kind of over here. The police presence is less about the sex workers and the vice happening in that area and more about there's a lot of immigrant populations up there and blue collar workers that are participating in labor riots, union riots, and unionization riots and things like that in the early 1900s.
Thank you. Well, we've come to our time, and thank you so much for coming and joining us. And we will have to have you back when the book is released, and so we can hear you brag about your book.
Thank you so much. You all have been
Thank you.
amazing. I've truly, truly enjoyed myself. And I might pop up to your next one. I want to see what everyone else is doing too.
Yeah, by all means. Yes.
We hope
Thank you.
this is the last one that we have slated so far for spring, but we might be adding a couple. I was just heard from our colleague Mike German, so we might be adding a couple. So please stay tuned, and we'll definitely be back in the fall for sure. But absolutely, please join us again when, like Stan said, when the book comes out, and join any one of our sessions.
Will do. Thank you all so
Right.
much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank
You
you.
too.
Thank
Take care.
Uh-huh. Hey, Jeremy, did you have a meeting yesterday?
Hold on, Stan, just a second.
Conversations on Race and Policing has been supported by funding from the California State University San Bernardino College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Faux Library, and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Finn Lee is our technical consultant. Pamela Crossan provides administrative support, and Alan Yavor provides communication support. There's more information in the show notes, and please join us online at csusb.edu/CORP for upcoming programming and to find our catalog of over 100 past events with guests like Robin D.G. Kelly, Jamal Bowman, Dorothy Roberts, and many more.